At exactly 10:15 a.m. on April 9, 1943, Captain Alexander Pokushkin climbed into the cockpit of his P-39 Airacobra at a forward airfield near Prinskaya, in southern Russia. He was preparing for what would become his first combat victory in an aircraft that would soon prove all its critics wrong. The fighter itself was American-built, shipped across two vast oceans, rejected by British pilots, dismissed by American squadrons, and written off as useless by almost every Western Air Force that had flown it. Just a day earlier, Pokushkin's commanding officer had informed him that a new batch of fighters would soon arrive, Lend-Lease aircraft from the United States. The British had tested these planes and refused to keep them. The Americans had used them briefly in the Pacific, but they were already being replaced with newer, better designs. Now, these second-hand machines were being sent to Russia, and Soviet pilots were expected to take them into battle against the Luftwaffe. Pokushkin had spent 2 years flying the Yak-1 and MiG-3, both reliable Soviet designs. Each could stand its ground against German Messerschmitts, but both suffered from serious flaws: radios that barely functioned, guns that jammed mid-fight, and engines that failed at the worst possible moments. The new American fighter, the P-39, already carried a notorious reputation. British pilots had labeled it a death trap, while American flyers in New Guinea mocked its performance, claiming it couldn't climb, couldn't turn with a zero, and couldn't reach bombers above 15,000 feet. One popular American joke in the Pacific went, "The P-400 is just a P-39 with a zero on its tail." The aircraft had one critical design flaw that doomed its chances with Western Air Forces. During development in 1938, the prototype was fitted with a turbocharger, which gave it excellent high-altitude performance. The first prototype, the XP-39, took its maiden flight on April 6, 1938, achieving a speed of 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, and reaching that altitude in just 5 minutes. However, in June 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps ordered the prototype into Naka wind tunnel tests to reduce drag and boost speed. The engineers discovered that the turbocharger system created too much aerodynamic drag. By August 1939, Bell Aircraft proposed removing the turbocharger altogether, replacing it with a simpler single-stage, single-speed supercharger. That single decision effectively destroyed the P-39's ability to operate at high altitude. Once it climbed above 15,000 feet, the engine began to struggle for oxygen, and its performance plummeted dramatically. By 20,000 feet, the fighter was virtually powerless. For the American and British Air Forces, which needed fighters capable of escorting bombers at altitudes of 25,000 feet or more, such a limitation was unacceptable. RAF test pilots flew the P-400, the export version, in late 1941 and immediately dismissed it. Their verdict was clear: the aircraft was inferior to both the Spitfire and the Hurricane at any altitude that mattered in combat. Worse still, it had a dangerous habit: it could suddenly enter a flat spin with little or no warning. The problem lay in its center of gravity, which sat too far to the rear because the engine was mounted behind the pilot. When the 37mm nose cannon was fired and its ammunition depleted, the aircraft became tail-heavy, destabilizing its flight balance. Several British test pilots nearly lost their lives during trials when their Airacobras went into uncontrollable spins from which they barely managed to recover. The Americans fared no better. By early 1942, P-39s and P-400s were deployed to help counter the Japanese advance across the Pacific. Squadrons flew them in Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, and throughout New Guinea. Pilots quickly realized what the British had already learned: the P-39 was incapable of intercepting Japanese bombers flying at 20,000 feet. It climbed too slowly to reach them, and when it finally did, it lacked the power to fight effectively. American pilots complained that the fighter felt sluggish and heavy above 15,000 feet, as if they were flying through thick mud. Its controls became slow to respond, its speed dropped sharply, and Japanese Zeros could easily outmaneuver it at high altitude. Lieutenant Evan Stevens, who flew P-39s with the 39th Fighter Squadron in New Guinea, later described his deep frustration. The aircraft looked impressive with its sleek fuselage and nose-mounted cannon, but it could not meet the demands of Pacific combat. In one encounter over Lae in April 1942, Stevens and his flight were scrambled to intercept a Japanese bombing raid. They climbed hard, pushing their Allison engines to maximum power output. But by the time they reached 15,000 feet, the enemy bombers were still 5,000 feet higher. The P-39 struggled desperately to climb further, their rate of ascent dropping to almost zero. The Zeros spotted them and dived down to engage. Stevens's wingman got caught in a turning dogfight at 18,000 feet, and the P-39 could barely handle the maneuver. The aircraft wallowed through the turn, slow, heavy, and hopelessly outclassed. The Zero flipped its maneuver and quickly got its guns aimed at him. Stevens watched in horror as his wingman's aircraft trailed thick smoke, spiraling down toward the ground. The issues, however, went far beyond poor altitude performance. The 37mm M4 cannon, installed in the nose and firing through the propeller hub, looked like a fearsome weapon on paper, but in real combat, it jammed constantly. Its slow firing rate of only 3 rounds per second, combined with the heavy shell's curved trajectory, made it nearly impossible to hit agile, fast-moving targets. Pilots often complained that the cannon would fire just a few rounds before jamming completely, leaving them to rely solely on their machine guns. On some missions, P-39s even took off with the nose cannon completely inoperative because maintenance crews couldn't keep them functional in the harsh jungle conditions. The .30 caliber guns mounted in the wings were far too weak to inflict serious damage on Japanese aircraft, and only the 2.50 caliber guns in the nose carried real stopping power, but even those weren't enough. By the close of 1942, frustrated American pilots throughout the Pacific had nicknamed the P-39 the Iron Dog. Many of them requested transfers to P-38 Lightning squadrons at the first opportunity. By December, the 5th Air Force reported around 80 enemy aircraft destroyed but had lost roughly the same number of P-39s, making the kill ratio only about 1-to-1, an unacceptable figure for a force that desperately needed air superiority against seasoned Japanese aviators. The only American pilot ever to achieve ace status in a P-39 was Second Lieutenant William Fiedler. Between January and June of 1943, Fiedler managed to shoot down 5 Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. His third kill came on June 12, when he brought down a 0-10 miles off Cape Esperance. 4 days later, while escorting a group of 50 Val dive bombers attacking American transports near Guadalcanal, he shot down 2 of them, becoming the sole P-39 ace in U.S. service. Tragically, just 2 weeks later, on June 30, 1943, Fiedler lost his life on the ground when a P-38 Lightning, suffering engine failure during takeoff, crashed into his parked P-39 as he sat in the cockpit. The collision caused both aircraft to explode. Fiedler was pulled from the wreckage unconscious and died shortly afterward from his injuries. He never lived long enough to appreciate the remarkable position he held in the history of American aviation. His tragic death came to symbolize the P-39's entire reputation among U.S. forces. Even its only ace pilot met his end not at the hands of an enemy, but through an accident that might never have occurred had he been flying another aircraft. By the middle of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces were already withdrawing the P-39 from combat service as newer replacements became available. Advanced fighters like the P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang began assuming frontline roles, while the remaining P-39s were pushed into training duties or assigned to secondary combat zones. In every mission the Americans had hoped it would excel in, the aircraft had fallen short. By all accounts, this should have marked the end of its story, a once promising design undone by one critical engineering choice, dismissed by the very Air Force that had commissioned it, and remembered only as a warning about the dangers of stripping essential components to reduce weight. But things took an unexpected turn in Russia. On the Eastern Front, air combat wasn't waged at the high altitudes typical in the West. When the first P-400 variants arrived in Murmansk via Arctic convoys in late 1941, Soviet pilots received them with little enthusiasm. They had already heard these planes were unwanted rejects, the leftovers that even the British had declined to use. Early test flights confirmed the rumors about the aircraft's dangerous spin behavior. Soviet test pilots intentionally tried to replicate the flat spin issue and managed to do so immediately. The fighter could drop into a brutal, uncontrollable flat spin with almost no warning, especially when the nose ammunition bay was empty. The display stunned American observers, who had been unable to reproduce the problem in their own trials back home. Yet amid the testing, Soviet pilots also made an important discovery. At altitudes below 15,000 feet, the P-39's performance was outstanding. Its Allison engine delivered strong, consistent power at low and medium levels. Below 12,000 feet, it was actually faster than most Soviet fighters. It handled responsively, rolled sharply, turned tightly, and offered superb visibility through its bubble canopy. Most crucial of all, it possessed something nearly every Soviet fighter lacked: a dependable radio. The SCR-522 radio system installed in the P-39 was clear, powerful, and consistently reliable, allowing Soviet pilots to communicate in real time, coordinate their attacks, issue warnings, and keep their formations disciplined and organized during combat. This innovation was nothing short of revolutionary for the Soviet Air Force, where most fighter aircraft either lacked radios altogether or had systems that barely functioned. For the first time, pilots could communicate clearly, their voices as audible as if they were speaking side by side on a telephone. They could exchange real-time information about enemy movements and tactical conditions, coordinate their maneuvers, and avoid being taken by surprise again. The P-39's armament was also formidable. Although the 37mm cannon had proven unreliable for American crews, Soviet maintenance teams managed to keep it in far better working order by focusing heavily on maintaining the weapon's functionality. The M4 cannon fired a massive shell capable of destroying an enemy aircraft with a single well-placed hit. While its slow firing rate, only about 3 rounds per second, had frustrated American pilots who struggled to hit agile targets, Soviet aviators quickly adapted their tactics. They trained to engage at closer ranges before opening fire, dramatically increasing their accuracy. They mastered the exact lead angles needed to compensate for the cannon's arcing trajectory and practiced relentlessly until its temperamental behavior became predictable and easy to handle. The P-39 also carried 2 nose-mounted .50 caliber machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. These guns, with their faster rate of fire and easier aiming characteristics, were often used by Soviet pilots to adjust their aim, walking their fire onto the target before finishing the attack with a decisive cannon burst. Together, this armament gave the P-39 the most powerful forward-firing weapon array of any Soviet fighter in service. Most domestically produced Soviet fighters carried only 1 or 2 cannons along with lighter machine guns, but the P-39's blend of a large-caliber cannon and twin heavy machine guns made it exceptionally lethal. Soviet pilots soon began modifying their aircraft further, removing the wing-mounted .30 caliber machine guns to reduce overall weight and enhance maneuverability. Those outboard guns, along with their ammunition, added roughly 60 pounds, and eliminating them shifted the aircraft's center of gravity slightly forward, improving stability. More importantly, this reduction in wing mass decreased rotational inertia, which significantly increased the aircraft's roll rate. With the wing guns gone, the P-39 became lighter, nimbler, and easier to maintain. The change worked flawlessly. Soviet pilot Nikolai Golodnikov later recalled, "We immediately removed the wing machine guns, leaving only 1 cannon and 2 machine guns. That modification improved the roll rate by reducing rotational inertia. The cockpit was extremely comfortable, and the visibility was excellent. The instrument panel was very well laid out, featuring a full set of gauges, including an artificial horizon and a radio compass." Soviet ground crews also introduced a series of mechanical modifications based on direct feedback from their pilots. In some squadrons, technicians fine-tuned the tension in the control cables to make the aircraft more responsive to inputs. Other teams reworked the oxygen delivery system to perform better at higher altitudes, though this adjustment was of lesser importance given that most engagements occurred at relatively low levels. The fuel system was also modified to improve engine starts in extreme cold, a crucial factor for maintaining readiness during the brutal Russian winters. While each of these changes seemed small on its own, together they greatly enhanced the P-39's adaptability to the unique challenges of the Eastern Front. The difference between Soviet and American maintenance philosophies was striking. U.S. mechanics operated under rigid regulations, following technical orders to the letter. Any modification had to pass through formal engineering approval processes, and improvisation in the field was either discouraged or outright prohibited. Such rigidity made sense for air forces working from well-equipped bases with reliable logistics chains, but it prevented the kind of creative, on-the-spot problem-solving that Soviet crews practiced daily. In contrast, Soviet mechanics had far more freedom to implement practical adjustments based on first-hand combat experience. Their alterations were often undocumented and lacked official sanction, yet they consistently proved effective. Most importantly, the conditions of air warfare on the Eastern Front perfectly complemented the P-39's capabilities while minimizing its weaknesses. In 1943, most aerial engagements between German and Soviet forces occurred at altitudes ranging from 5,000 to 15,000 feet. Ground attack missions were flown at very low levels, while fighter escorts typically operated at medium heights. The immense tank battles and relentless artillery exchanges that defined the front required aircraft to remain close to the ground, providing direct support to troops, precisely where the P-39 excelled. Unlike the air campaigns in the Pacific or Western Europe, where bombers often attacked from 20,000 feet or higher, German bombing raids on the Eastern Front were usually conducted below 15,000 feet when targeting Soviet positions. Dive-bombing Stukas struck from low altitudes, and Ju-88 level bombers seldom exceeded 12,000 feet during operations. Their escort fighters maintained similar flight levels, allowing Soviet P-39 pilots to engage the enemy within the exact altitude range where their aircraft's performance was strongest. Between roughly 8,000 and 15,000 feet, the P-39 could outpace early versions of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and even keep up with later variants. The aircraft could hold its own against nearly every German fighter except the latest models of the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb heavy damage in combat and still remain airborne, while the thick armor plating around the cockpit provided exceptional protection for the pilot. Soviet aviators quickly grew deeply fond of the machine, affectionately giving it the nickname Kobrushka, meaning dear little cobra, or sometimes Kobra Lastaka, a blend of the words for cobra and swallow. This fondness was no exaggeration, it reflected genuine admiration for the aircraft's reliability and performance. Getting these Cobras into Soviet hands, however, was an extraordinary challenge in itself. Each P-39 intended for the USSR began its life at the Bell Aircraft Corporation factory in Wheatfield, New York. From there, the planes were flown to Great Falls, Montana, often by female pilots from the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, who ferried them across the length of the American continent. Upon arrival in Great Falls, male U.S. Army Air Force's pilots took over and flew the fighters northwest toward Fairbanks or Nome, Alaska. Even this leg of the trip was grueling, involving thousands of miles over sparsely populated wilderness, but the most perilous stretch was still to come. At the Alaskan airfields, the American pilots handed the aircraft over to Soviet pilots, who then embarked on the treacherous journey across the Bering Sea to Siberia. This transfer route, officially known as the Alaska-Siberia Airbridge or ALSIB, was among the most hazardous and unusual supply lines of the entire war. Soviet aviators flew these single-seat fighters in small formations, accompanied by twin-engine bombers or transport planes that provided navigation support and served as a safety escort. The route spanned immense expanses of open ocean, where even a minor engine failure would result in a fatal plunge into the icy waters below. The weather was unforgiving, with violent storms materializing without warning. Navigational aids were minimal, and the endless stretches of sea and ice offered almost no landmarks to guide them. Many pilots never reached their destination, vanishing into the Arctic wilderness without a trace. Those who survived the journey landed at remote airfields in eastern Siberia, where ground crews inspected the aircraft, made necessary repairs, and prepared them for further flight. From there, the P-39s continued their long trek westward across the Siberian tundra, eventually arriving at staging bases near the front lines. The voyage from the Bell factory in New York to a combat regiment in the Soviet Union often took several weeks and covered more than 7,000 miles. Every Airacobra that arrived in a Soviet squadron had already endured a journey as dangerous and demanding as any combat mission. Among the pilots who would make the P-39 legendary in Soviet service was Captain Alexander Pokushkin. By the beginning of 1943, Pokushkin had already achieved nearly 20 confirmed aerial victories flying MiG-3s and Yak-1 fighters, earning a reputation as one of the Red Air Force's most skilled aces. He was bold, methodical, and constantly analyzing tactics to gain an edge over German pilots. When his unit, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, transitioned to P-39s in January 1943, Pokushkin devoted himself entirely to mastering the new aircraft. He spent weeks training away from the front lines, carefully studying the fighter's performance characteristics, learning both its advantages and limitations. He devised new combat techniques specifically tailored to the P-39's capabilities. One notable innovation was the bookshelf formation. Pokushkin arranged his fighters in stacked layers at different altitudes, each layer providing coverage for the one below it, with clearly defined roles. If an enemy aircraft evaded the first layer, the second layer would intercept it, and if the second layer engaged, the third layer provided protective cover. This formation demanded precise coordination and communication, made possible only by the P-39's reliable radio system. Pokushkin also pioneered coordination with ground-based radar. The 4th Air Army received its first mobile radar units in the summer of 1942, and Pokushkin collaborated with radar controllers to develop interception procedures. Using radio guidance, Soviet fighters could be directed toward German formations before establishing visual contact. The system proved highly effective, allowing Soviet pilots to ambush German aircraft with perfect positioning. On April 9, 1943, Pokushkin flew his first combat mission in a P-39. 8 Airacobra fighters intercepted a formation of German Messerschmitt Bf-109s attacking Soviet La-3s over Krimskaya. Pokushkin dove from altitude, singled out a Bf-109, and opened fire with all available weapons. The 37mm cannon shells tore along the fuselage, causing the enemy engine to explode. Debris scattered as the fighter rolled inverted, trailing thick black smoke. Pokushkin's first P-39 kill. Just 3 days later, on April 12, he downed 4 Messerschmitt 109s in a single engagement over the same region. Using the bookshelf formation, he coordinated attacks with his flight, directing each pilot into position via the P-39's radio. German fighters attempted to counter, but the Soviet formation adapted instantly, maintaining altitude advantage, dictating the engagement, and shooting down 4 enemy planes without sustaining losses. Between April 9 and April 30, 1943, Pokushkin claimed a total of 12 aerial victories flying the P-39. Other pilots in his regiment were achieving comparable success. The tactics were spreading quickly, and the results were undeniable. On April 29, 1943, one of the most famous air engagements occurred. 8 P-39 Airacobras, including one piloted by Pokushkin, were guided by ground control toward a large German formation. 3 full squadrons of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were being escorted by a group of Bf-109s. The Soviets launched their attack from above. A pair of P-39s engaged the fighters, while the remaining 6 dived through the bomber formation, repeating their strikes multiple times. The engagement lasted only minutes, but the results were devastating for the Germans. 12 German aircraft were destroyed, and Pokushkin personally claimed 5 kills. Not a single Soviet aircraft was lost. This was the kind of success that Soviet pilots had seldom experienced earlier in the war. On May 24, 1943, Pokushkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award. By June, he was promoted to major and given command of a squadron. He exchanged his P-39K1 model for a new P-39N, aircraft number 100, marked with white numerals, which he would fly for the remainder of the war. The Germans began to notice a change. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe pilots on the Eastern Front reported that Soviet fighters were performing differently, more aggressive, better coordinated, and harder to surprise. Intelligence reports described American-built fighters with heavy nose armament, fast at low altitude, and always operating in coordinated groups with excellent radio discipline. Grigory Rekalov, flying as Pokushkin's wingman in the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, also became a P-39 expert. Rekalov had an unusual backstory. He suffered from color blindness, a condition that should have disqualified him from flying. He concealed it throughout training and the early war. On July 26, 1941, during a combat sortie, Rekalov's I-16 was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He was wounded in the right leg but managed to land his damaged aircraft safely. Surgeons managed to save Rechkov's leg, but he spent several months recovering. He returned to active duty in April 1942 and continued flying despite his color vision deficiency. Rechkov had begun the war flying I-16s and I-153s, achieving only modest success. When his regiment transitioned to P-39s, Rekalov found his true stride. The aircraft complemented his aggressive flying style perfectly. By the end of 1942, Rechkov had achieved 4 solo victories and 2 shared victories. By May 1943, after 2 months of flying the P-39 in combat over the Kuban, he had accumulated 12 solo victories and 2 shared. The aircraft dramatically increased his effectiveness as a fighter pilot. On May 24, 1943, the same day that Pokushkin received his first Hero of the Soviet Union award, Rekalov was also awarded the same honor. Both men flew P-39s, and both would achieve the majority of their wartime victories in these American-built fighters. Rechkov ultimately scored 44 of his 56 victories in P-39s. Most of these victories came while flying 2 specific aircraft for extended periods, P-39O serial number 42 to 8747 and P-39Q serial number 44 to 2547. He marked both aircraft with his initials, RGA, on the tail. Soviet mechanics maintained these fighters meticulously. Rekalov developed a personal bond with these aircraft, learned their quirks, trusted their reliability, and pushed them to their limits in combat. He survived being shot down, endured multiple wounds, and participated in one catastrophic engagement on May 31, 1944, where 5 P-39s were lost after he pursued enemy fighters alone rather than maintaining formation discipline. Yet, he continued flying the Airacobra, kept scoring victories, and consistently proved that the aircraft rejected by the Americans could dominate when in the right hands and flown in the proper tactical environment. By June 1943, several other Soviet pilots were achieving remarkable success with P-39s. Nikolai Gulov scored 32 of his 57 victories in Airacobras and became known for his aggressive tactics and exceptional marksmanship. He preferred to close to very short range before opening fire, maximizing the P-39's concentrated firepower. His method was risky but incredibly effective. Gulov received the Hero of the Soviet Union award twice and survived the war despite being shot down multiple times. Dmitry Glinker scored 50 victories, the vast majority in P-39s. Glinker served in the 100th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment and was known for his methodical combat style. Unlike some aces who relied on instinct and aggression, Glinker studied his opponents carefully, searching for patterns and weaknesses. He maintained detailed notes on German tactics and shared his observations with fellow pilots. His analytical approach perfectly complemented Pokushkin's tactical innovations. Glinker was seriously wounded on July 15, 1944, when he bailed out of his heavily damaged Airacobra and struck its tailplane during ejection. He survived but required months of recovery. Alexander Clubb scored 31 of his 50 victories in American-built fighters. Clubb was among the pilots involved in the May 31, 1944 engagement in which Rekolov's formation lost 5 aircraft. Despite that setback, Clubb continued flying P-39s and achieved consistent success throughout 1944. His experience proved that even in difficult engagements against newer German fighters, skilled pilots in P-39s could survive and prevail. Another notable P-39 pilot was Ivan Babach, who scored 33 victories, most in Cobras. Babach was renowned for his exceptional eyesight and his ability to spot enemy aircraft before his wingmen. This skill, combined with the P-39's radio, made him an invaluable early warning asset for his formation. Babach would detect German fighters at extreme range, relay their positions via radio, and guide his formation into optimal attack positions. His contributions extended far beyond his personal kill count. The pattern was evident: half of the Soviet Union's top 10 aces achieved the majority of their victories flying P-39s. This was not a small sample or a statistical anomaly. It reflected a fundamental truth about the aircraft's effectiveness in Soviet service. This was not coincidence, it was the systematic outcome of aligning aircraft capabilities with mission requirements. The Soviets received 4,719 P-39s through Lend-Lease, representing more than one-third of all American and British fighters supplied to Soviet forces. Nearly half of the entire P-39 production went to Russia. These aircraft were flown intensively, maintained under harsh conditions, and deployed continuously in combat. Soviet Airacobra losses totaled 1,030 aircraft between 1942 and 1945, 49 in 1942, 305 in 1943, 486 in 1944, and 190 in 1945. The loss rate rose as the war escalated and Soviet forces advanced westward, encountering increasingly concentrated Luftwaffe resistance and newer German fighters such as the FW-190 and late-model Bf-109s. However, the victories increased even faster. By mid-1943, the kill ratio for Soviet P-39 units had become positive, destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This reversed the earlier exchange rate in the war, when Soviet fighters frequently traded 1-for-1 or worse with the Luftwaffe. German pilots began to recognize and fear certain Soviet formations. When Pokushkin's unit was deployed to operations in Ukraine, Luftwaffe radio operators would alert their pilots whenever he was in the air. Pokushkin used the radio callsign Satka, meaning 100, the number painted on his aircraft. German pilots learned that hearing Satka signaled Pokushkin was airborne. Some Luftwaffe units were even ordered to remain on the ground when radio intelligence confirmed he was flying. This was unprecedented. A single Soviet pilot flying an American fighter rejected by Western air forces was forcing the Luftwaffe to avoid combat. German after-action reports from the Eastern Front between mid-1943 and late 1944 showed a consistent trend. Luftwaffe pilots reported increasing difficulty achieving favorable engagement outcomes against Soviet fighters. The reports specifically highlighted American-built aircraft with distinctive profiles and aggressive, coordinated tactics. German intelligence officers attempted to determine the cause of the change, examining crashed P-39s recovered from Soviet territory and discovering the field modifications made by Soviet mechanics. Wing guns were removed, control systems were adjusted, and radios were modified. Yet German analysts could not comprehend how these seemingly minor adjustments produced such profound tactical advantages. The true advantage was not in the modifications themselves, but in what they represented: Soviet pilots and mechanics collaborating to optimize aircraft for their specific mission needs. This kind of field-driven innovation was rare in the rigidly hierarchical Luftwaffe, where modifications required formal engineering approval from Germany. Soviet units could test changes, assess results, and implement improvements within days, while German units needed weeks or even months to complete similar processes. German tactical responses evolved throughout late 1943 and 1944. Some pilots tried to avoid engagement with P-39 formations entirely, waiting for isolated opportunities to attack individual Soviet fighters. This defensive posture contradicted earlier Luftwaffe doctrine and reduced German operational effectiveness. Other pilots attempted more aggressive tactics, closing quickly to counter Soviet coordination advantages, but aggression without matching performance benefits only led to faster deaths. Several experienced Luftwaffe aces were killed in 1944 while employing tactics that had been highly effective in 1942 against less capable Soviet opponents. The psychological impact was substantial. For nearly 2 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated Soviet airspace. German pilots flew with confidence, believing their aircraft were superior and their tactics proven. That confidence began to erode as ace pilots who had scored dozens of victories were shot down by Soviet pilots flying American fighters. The tactics that had reliably succeeded for 2 years were suddenly failing. The reasons were difficult for German intelligence to discern. The aircraft appeared identical to the ones Americans had flown. Engines were the same, armament was similar, yet Soviet pilots flew differently, coordinated better, and seemed consistently to hold informational advantages. What the Germans could not see were the subtle but critical modifications made by Soviet mechanics and the tactical innovations developed by Soviet pilots, the removal of wing guns to improve roll rate, disciplined radio usage that prevented ambushes, and ground radar coordination that positioned Soviet fighters perfectly for attacks. The stacked altitude formations provided Soviet pilots with multiple opportunities to engage enemy aircraft. The aggressive training emphasized teamwork over individual glory. All of these elements combined to make the P-39 in Soviet hands a completely different weapon than what American or British forces had fielded. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters to P-39s at rates previously unseen earlier in the war. Veteran German pilots who had scored numerous victories against Soviet aircraft were now being shot down by Airacobras. On September 21, 1943, Pokushkin shot down 3 Ju-88 bombers in a single pass at low altitude. The engagement was observed by many Soviet ground troops and journalists, further spreading his reputation. The achievement was remarkable not only for the number of kills but also because it demonstrated the P-39's capability against multiple targets in rapid succession. Throughout the autumn of 1943, Soviet P-39 units continued their successes. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, equipped entirely with Airacobras, became one of the most feared Soviet units on the Eastern Front. German pilots learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the Allison engine and the visual profile of Soviet Airacobras flying in formation. Unlike earlier in the war, when Soviet fighters operated individually or in loose pairs, P-39 units flew in tight, coordinated formations with constant radio communication. Tactical innovations continued to evolve. Soviet pilots developed the pendulum patrol pattern, in which fighters flew overlapping elliptical paths rather than straight lines. This technique maintained speed, prevented ambushes, and ensured continuous coverage of assigned airspace. The pattern was impossible without reliable radios and well-trained pilots who could maintain formation discipline. Soviet P-39 units met both requirements. The kill ratios tell the story. In 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed Soviet aircraft at rates of 5:1 or higher. By early 1942, the ratio had improved to 3:1 in Germany's favor. By late 1943, after the P-39s had been in Soviet service for a year, the ratio approached 1:1. In some engagements, Soviet P-39 units achieved positive kill ratios, destroying more German aircraft than they lost. This marked a profound change in the air war over the Eastern Front. It wasn't because German pilots had lost skill. The Luftwaffe remained one of the most professional air forces in the world. However, they now faced Soviet pilots flying aircraft that finally matched German equipment, with radios enabling coordination, training emphasizing teamwork and tactics, and firepower capable of destroying German fighters with a single burst. The P-39 provided Soviet pilots with the tools they had long needed. Everything else, the tactics, aggression, and determination, had always been present. Now they had an aircraft that could fully execute their plans. American pilots in the Pacific and European theaters never experienced this potential. They flew P-39s in environments that exposed every weakness while offering no opportunity to exploit the aircraft's strengths. High-altitude bomber escort required performance the P-39 lacked. Pacific island hopping demanded range the P-39 could not provide. Engaging agile Japanese Zeros at altitude meant operating where the P-39 was at its weakest. In those contexts, failure was inevitable. The contrast in tactical philosophy was stark. American fighter doctrine in the Pacific emphasized individual initiative and aggressive pursuit of targets. Pilots were trained to engage whenever an opportunity arose and to press attacks until the enemy was either destroyed or escaped. This approach worked well in aircraft like the P-38 or P-47, which had performance margins sufficient to recover from errors. In the P-39, operating at the limits of its performance envelope, aggressive individual action often led to disaster. Pilots pursuing targets into disadvantageous positions frequently found themselves unable to disengage when threatened. Soviet fighter doctrine, by contrast, evolved in the opposite direction during the war. Early Soviet tactics had focused on mass attacks with limited coordination. Individual pilots had little initiative and were expected to follow formation leaders rigidly. This approach failed catastrophically in 1941 and 1942. By 1943, Soviet doctrine had transformed. Pilots were trained to operate in coordinated pairs in flights with constant radio communication. Individual initiative was encouraged, but always within the framework of formation discipline. Pilots could adapt tactics to immediate situations while maintaining overall coordination with wingmen and flight leaders. He never wavered in his belief that the P-39 was an outstanding fighter when employed properly. Several times throughout the war, directives from Moscow instructed his units to consider switching to Soviet-built aircraft, such as the La-5 or Yak fighters. Pokushkin rejected these requests each time, preferring to retain his American aircraft. Kolov achieved 56 confirmed victories and 6 shared victories. He flew 452 combat sorties and participated in 122 dogfights over the course of the war. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union twice, on May 24, 1943, and July 1, 1944. After the war, he graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1951, commanded various regiments and air divisions, and became deputy commander of fighter aircraft for the Far Eastern Air Defense Army in 1957. He reached the rank of Major General of Aviation in 1959 before retiring. He authored 2 books recounting his experiences. He passed away on December 20, 1990, at the age of 70. Lieutenant William Fiedler, the only American P-39 ace, is buried in a cemetery in Ohio. His service record notes 5 victories in the P-39 between January and June 1943. No American pilot ever exceeded that total in the aircraft. The contrast could not be more stark, one American ace versus dozens of Soviet aces. The difference was not pilot skill. American pilots were well-trained, aggressive, and capable. The distinction lay in mission requirements and the tactical environment. The story of the P-39 is a story of context. Bell Aircraft designed it as a high-altitude interceptor to defend the American coast. When the turbocharger was removed, it became a medium-altitude fighter. Western air forces attempted to use it as a high-altitude fighter anyway, and it failed. Soviet air forces tested it as a medium-altitude fighter, and it succeeded spectacularly. The aircraft remained the same, only its application changed. On May 9, 1945, Soviet Captain Vasily Shinichikov, flying an Airacobra, shot down a German FW-189 Flau-Wolf reconnaissance aircraft over Prague. This marked the final aerial victory of World War II in Europe. Hours later, Germany surrendered. The P-39 that Western air forces had dismissed as worthless delivered the final kill of the European war. That same day, a German Mi-262 jet fighter shot down a P-39 over Bohemia, marking the final Luftwaffe victory of the war. The Airacobra had been present at the very beginning of Lend-Lease operations to the Soviet Union and remained active until the very end of the conflict. Soviet Airacobras continued flying operational missions until 1949, when the last regiments retired the type and transitioned to jet aircraft. The P-39 served longer in Soviet service than it ever did in American or British service and achieved significantly greater success. Post-war, American military analysts studied the Soviet employment of P-39s and found the results difficult to reconcile. Some reports suggested that the Soviets employed different tactics. Others proposed that German pilots on the Eastern Front were inferior to those in the West. German records disproved this. The reality was simpler and more uncomfortable. The P-39 succeeded in Soviet service because it was employed correctly. Mission requirements dictated success, not the inherent quality of the aircraft. Interviews with Soviet pilots after the war consistently praised the P-39. Rechkov stated in a 1950s interview, "Of course, our fighters quickly caught up with the German Air Force, but aircraft like the P-39Q were well balanced for air combat. The most important advantage, in my opinion, was the high-sensitivity radio. The radio on the Airacobra allowed communication with flightmates in any situation as if they were speaking on a telephone next to each other." Other Soviet pilots echoed the same sentiments. The radio, more than any other single feature, revolutionized Soviet fighter operations. Comparisons with Soviet-built fighters highlighted this transformation. The Yak series fighters were lighter and more maneuverable than the P-39s. The La-5 and La-7 had superior climb rates and comparable speeds, but none matched the P-39's combination of firepower, radio reliability, robust construction, and pilot protection. Soviet pilots who flew both types generally preferred the American fighter for these advantages. The few Soviet aces who scored more victories in domestic fighters than in P-39s, such as Ivan Kozydub, who scored 62 victories primarily in LA-5s and LA-7s, were exceptions that proved the rule about the P-39's effectiveness. Today, the P-39 Airacobra is remembered primarily as a failure in Western aviation history. Museums display them with captions explaining their rejection by American forces. Aviation enthusiasts know it as the fighter that nobody wanted. Books about World War II aircraft often dismiss it in a few paragraphs, highlighting its shortcomings. What those accounts rarely convey is the complete story. Over 4,000 Soviet pilots flew P-39s in combat, achieving roughly 3,000 individual victories according to Soviet claims adjusted for known overcounting. These pilots developed innovative tactics that transformed air warfare on the Eastern Front. They demonstrated that understanding your tools and using them appropriately matters far more than having theoretically superior equipment employed incorrectly. The lessons extend beyond aviation. Organizations frequently discard tools or methods that fail in one context, never considering that they might excel in another. The common assumption that failure in one situation indicates universal failure is often misguided. The P-39 failed for Americans and British forces because they required capabilities it could not provide. It succeeded for Soviets because it perfectly matched their operational needs. Both outcomes were predictable once mission requirements and tactical environments were considered. Soviet pilots who flew the P-39 regarded it as an exceptional fighter, ideally suited to their missions. When a pilot scored 47 victories in a single aircraft, when the aircraft's radio coordination repeatedly saved lives, when its cannon destroyed enemy planes with single bursts, it was not seen as a failure. It was seen as a tool that performed exactly as needed. That was the P-39's reality in Soviet service, a fighter that provided technological parity with the Luftwaffe, heavy forward firepower, reliable communications, and durable construction. These advantages, combined with Soviet tactical innovations and pilot skill, enabled air superiority over the Eastern Front. The story matters because it is about more than one aircraft. It is about the significance of matching capabilities to requirements, about not dismissing tools that failed in one context without considering other applications, and about understanding that different tactical environments demand different solutions. The P-39 taught these lessons. American and British forces learned them through frustration and failure, while Soviet forces learned them through testing and success. The aircraft itself remained unchanged, the difference was everything around it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Every story matters. Every story deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.